Thank you all for joining us in our 2024 complimentary webinar series covering the FAR, or Federal Acquisition Regulations. We're coming to you live today from Washington, D.C. We're so glad you're here. Okay, so a little bit about the series. As usual, all of our webinars are complimentary and recorded. The FAR has 52 total parts, and we'll run them sequentially each week on Wednesdays and Fridays at noon Eastern Time. The recordings and PowerPoints will be posted within 24 hours of the webinar ending. You can find the recordings on our YouTube channel simply by subscribing to it using the link you see on the screen. There is no cost. You can find the PowerPoint on the SlideShare site using your LinkedIn credentials to log in. Again, there's no cost for this. We also offer sponsorship opportunities. If you're interested, please send us an email to hello@jenniferschaus.com. And now, how to sign up for the series. Unfortunately, there's no bulk registration. You must register individually for each webinar. If you go to the Jennifer Schaus website, navigate to the section called the FAR, and you'll find the individual registration links. Also, the recording links will be posted here upon completion of each webinar. Please note, we covered the FAR in 2020, so if you're eager to get a jump start, please find these historical recordings on our site. Navigate to the Webinars tab and scroll down to the section, the FAR 2020. Because it has been 4 years, many of the regulations have changed and been updated. Please use this as a reference tool only. And now a little bit about us. We work with established federal contractors worldwide, helping them to navigate the market. Our services range from market analysis reports to contract vehicles and compliance. Some of the contract vehicles we support are listed here on your screen. For more information, please visit our website. Okay, and those were our services for federal contractors. We also provide marketing and advertising services for organizations who are selling to federal contractors. We can add extra muscle to your marketing efforts via our newsletter ads and webinar sponsorships to in-person events. Please email us and ask for our media kit. Speaking of events, we hope at the John F. Kennedy Center on Monday, February 12th for an evening of networking. Our winter soiree will bring in about 300 federal contractors as well as confirmed attendance from the DoD, the VA, including NAVAIR, NAVSEA, and NSWC. Please register in advance on our website under events as tickets generally sell out. We hope to see you there. Please join us in the Virginia Apex Accelerator for a complimentary virtual class on marketing to the U.S. federal government and prime contractors. Jennifer will present and answer your questions in this 2-hour webinar. Registration is free. Please sign up on our webinar under events. Please sign up on our website under events. The webinar is next week on Thursday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Please join us and our friends at the Michigan Apex Accelerator next month on Thursday, March 28th, as we delve into the GSA schedule basics. This webinar is also complimentary and can be found on our website under the events section. Our webinars are complimentary thanks to our longtime and generous corporate sponsors and in-kind sponsors. Please allow me to introduce them. We would like to thank our friends at GovEvents, the premier platform for posting events related to government and government contracting. You can find all of our webinars and our events on govevents.com, as well as recordings from our past 600+ webinars. We also want to thank Tom Johnson and his team at Set Aside Alert, the go-to publication for contracting opportunities for the small, women-owned, veteran-owned, hub zone, and 8A firms. Visit setasidealert.com for more information. The Fairfax Economic Development Authority has an online calendar of events and webinars. We want to thank them for posting our events and webinars on their calendar. The Virginia Apex Accelerator at George Mason University offers free one-on-one counseling to established government contracting firms in Virginia on federal, state, and local procurement topics. If you're interested in learning more, please use the links provided to explore their services, review homework recommendations, register for live training, and find useful links to agencies and other self-directed learning. One-on-one counseling is limited to eligible client companies. Appointment requests are handled in the order they were received and based on counselor availability due to high demand. Online resources and group trainings are free with no restriction on business location. Join the Greater Reston Chamber of Commerce's monthly GovCon Council meeting to network with contracting peers, learn about upcoming events, opportunities, and also contribute to future programming. The meetings take place on the 4th Tuesday of each month at 8:30 a.m. at the Greater Reston Chamber of Commerce. The next meeting will be on Tuesday, February 27th. Please contact Alicia Field if you have questions about the meeting. Alicia's email address is at the bottom of your screen. Do you want help winning government contracts? BidSpeed can help. Users can find contract opportunities from federal, state, and local government. Additionally, you can search for teaming partners, incumbent point of contact, expiring contracts, compliance matrices, and also proposal templates. Create your login today at bidspeed.com. BidSpeed is an official partner of the U.S. Small Businesses Management and Technical Assistance Program. Events are the ultimate engagement channel to bring government and industry together. 68% of government personnel report that they attend more than one event each year. The Federal Business Council, or FBC, has worked with government and industry for 45 plus years to create gatherings where ideas are shared and to help government achieve its goals. This includes agency industry days, cybersecurity symposiums, technology expos, and offsite meetings. FBC provides full lifecycle meeting planning and event management. With over 5,000 meetings under their belt, FBC has the experience, systems, and personnel to make your next event exceptional. Learn more at www.fbcinc.com. Please check out our friends over at GovBrew. GovBrew is the most read GovCon newsletter, keeping thousands of GovCon professionals in the loop with news, updates, and opportunities in the federal contracting market, all in a fun and accessible email that only takes 5 minutes to read. It's 100% free to join. It goes out every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 a.m. It's filled with great content, event postings, webinars, and more. We encourage you to sign up at govbrew.co, or you can use the QR code you see on the screen. Okay, now let's meet today's speaker. Please welcome Margaret Cassidy to the webinar. Margaret, we're honored to have you with us today and are excited to hear your presentation on the FAR. We appreciate the time you took to put together the content. Margaret, I'll now put myself on mute and turn the floor over to you. Please let me know when you're ready for your next slide and I'll advance them as discussed.
Great, thanks, Sophia. Welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining Jennifer and her team today as we talk about FAR Part 3, Improper Business Practices and Personal Conflicts of Interest. You can advance to the next slide. And on to the next slide. So what are we going to cover today? This is the section of the FAR where the government lays down its expectations for government contractors. It does provide some very granular guidance and requirements and expectations of what contractors must and must not do. But it's also a section of the FAR that's a little bit more amorphous and philosophical than the other sections, because it's a section of the FAR that talks about where the government wants its contractors to be when it comes to integrity and ethics. As we go through this, we're going to cover what those expectations are around integrity and ethics, how those regulations define your interactions with government persons, your interactions with other businesses, how the government manages whistleblowers and what they expect of government contractors for folks who do raise a concern. By the way, I don't like the term whistleblower at all, but that's what the regulations call it. I prefer to call people who raise concerns or ask questions. Simply a person who raises a concern or asks a question. And it's government contractors. You want to be very attuned to these people because they may save you from significant headaches and really come up with ways to improve your processes or to otherwise alert you to a situation. Last, we're going to talk about an ethics and compliance program and some practical tips that you could implement as an organization to follow these laws and regulations. By way of quick background for myself, before we dive into this, I started my law career early on as a prosecutor, doing all sorts of crimes from little retail thefts and then to homicides and assaults. And then eventually I prosecuted public corruption, ethics violations, securities fraud, other fraud. And then I went in-house to two very large companies, General Electric and PricewaterhouseCoopers, where I was their government ethics compliance officer, making sure that they complied with all things that they needed to comply with when working with foreign, federal, or state governments. Started my own law firm to support small businesses in doing the sort of work that I did when I was in-house, because I realized small businesses can't always have a full-time me on board to manage some of these requirements. So let's get going and talk about these. We can move to the next slide. I will try to give some color to some of this as well, because the old prosecutor in me will jump out when it comes to things that can go wrong. So let's talk about what the government expects of government contractors. Next slide. So the government in the FAR puts standards in there. It says the government business shall be conducted in a manner that's above reproach. It says that the government business shall be done with impartiality and the highest degree of trust. It talks about contractors having to be responsible. And then there's an expectation that contractors are going to train and communicate with their employees on these ethical standards and on how to comply with all of the government regulations that you're going to learn about today, but that you're going to learn about otherwise through Jennifer's seminars. This is a vital slide for us to keep in mind as we go through this. So as a government contractor, your business partner, your customer is the government. You're getting paid by taxpayer dollars. That's why the government wants its business to be done impartially. They want you to have, they want to have trust in you, and they want you to operate in a manner of above reproach. That's why this is an interesting section of the FAR, because oftentimes the question that a lawyer will get is this conduct or is this activity legal? Well, even when the answer can be yes, it's legal, this section of the FAR tells contractors legality, yes, you got to follow the rules, but we want you to take it one step further. We expect you to behave with ethics and integrity, which sometimes has greater expectations of you from a behavior perspective than simply following the regulations. I'll try to highlight that a couple times. Sophia, we can move to the next slide. Okay, so here are some ways that you can interact with the government where things can go south very quickly and that are prohibited by this section of the FAR Part 3, improper conduct. I'm going to note, though, that FAR Part 3 is federal acquisition regulations, but in many instances, the regulations that are included in FAR Part 3 have behind them actual criminal statutes. So in the worst case scenario, violating the FAR in some instances can also find a prosecutor, or excuse me, find a contractor violating criminal laws or their employees violating criminal laws. So what are some of those as you interact with the government person? There's bribery or corruption. Bribery means exchanging something of value for government action or inaction. That's not in the FAR because there's a crime that says you can't bribe people in the government. But what is in the FAR is limitations around gifts, gratuities, and entertainment. It tells you that gifts are generally prohibited to government persons. We're going to cover this section in a little bit more detail. That's a FAR requirement for you all as contractors, but it's also an ethics requirement for your government colleagues. We'll talk about that more. Lobbying and what you can do with your federal funds is also identified here in this section of the FAR. Conflicts of interest, both personal, professional, or business relationships that you may have with government persons may violate corruption laws, conflicts of interest laws, note which are criminal, but they also are in this section of the FAR as a federal acquisition regulation. And then last, the procurement laws, which define how the regulations, which defines how a procurement process should go and defines how conflicts of interest, what they are and how some of them should be avoided, are also in this section of the FAR. And sometimes a violation of the Procurement Integrity Act, by way of example, may also result in a criminal conviction. So your FAR acquisition regulations are a place to start in guiding you all in what the government defines as improper conduct. But that improper conduct stretches far beyond the FAR into other laws and regulations, like those that guide your government colleagues and then those that prohibit things as being a crime. Let's move to the next slide. Oops, I think we missed a couple slides. Could you go back? Okay, next. Okay, so disclosures and certifications. So this is for many parts of this FAR, you're going to make when you turn in your RFP, when you sign on the dotted line for your contract, when you complete your SAM certification, you're making a disclosure or a certification that you have complied with these laws and regulations. So the lobbying prohibitions that you have in this section. the personal conflicts of interest that you have in this section. When you sign your contract, your RFP, or your SAM cert, you're basically saying, yes, my company has been following these laws and regulations that are contained in the FAR. And the government takes the position, and if you really read what you sign when you sign the SAM certification in particular, the very last little paragraph before you sign talks about that you're signing it under criminal penalty and that you're being truthful when you sign it, and that what you're saying by answering SAM is current, accurate, and complete. And if that information is inaccurate or you're making a misrepresentation to the government, the SAM tells you that you could be facing criminal penalties for basically not telling the truth to the government. So it's important to understand these regulations, and then important to understand that you're going to promise the government and certify to the government that you're complying with these regulations in your organization. Next slide, please. One of the things that the government also puts in this section of the FAR is the mandatory reporting section. And mandatory reporting applies to contractors who have contracts worth $6 million and lasting longer than 6 months. And it says to contractors that if something has gone wrong at your company, or you suspect or got an inkling, or the whistleblower raises a concern or a question around criminal fraud, behavior that could be fraudulent, behavior that could be a conflict of interest, behavior that could violate the False Claims Act, which is when you make a misrepresentation to the government about what you have going on with your contract or how your business is operating. If you've received a significant overpayment from the government, if you have any of these things occur in your business, and you have contracts worth $6 million or lasting longer than 6 months, you are obligated to investigate that situation. And then if there's credible evidence that you have some sort of criminal activity, the government has overpaid you, or potential violation of the False Claims Act, credible evidence of one of those things happening, you actually, as a government contractor, you have to go tell the government that this happened. So this mandates that you investigate these sort of situations, particularly in this section of the FAR, if you think maybe you're not following them to a T. And then you make your report to the government if you have credible evidence that that incident occurred. We can move on to the next slide. So what if you fail to report? What if you're like, well, maybe this did happen. Maybe we did get an overpayment from the government. Maybe we do have a situation that appears there's credible evidence that our employees may have been engaging in a conflict of interest. And I know I heard one time that we're supposed to report this. What happens if we fail to report? Failing to report sanction is basically debarment. If the government is able to show that you knew you should have reported and you didn't, and you also can get debarred if you didn't report the information in a timely, you didn't disclose it in a timely manner. The government does not disclose to say what a timely manner is. You know, for a small investigation that does not involve a lot of information or involve a lot of people, you can get through that quickly. But imagine a big defense contractor with a significant problem around, you know, overpayments from the government or something like that. Timely disclosure may be a very long time as they go through all of their invoices and their financial systems to figure out why there's an overpayment. And then last, the person who has to decide not to disclose or fail to disclose has to be a principal in the organization, which is essentially anybody, officer, director, owner, or anybody with some sort of supervisory responsibility. I would submit it's most people in an organization, so you don't want to use that as a reason that you don't disclose or that you don't investigate because you decide the person who knew about it and didn't investigate was not a principal. That's probably not going to get you very far. So bottom line on mandatory disclosure, if you have enough contract dollars, you've got to be alert and be monitoring your systems to see if there's ever a situation where you may have to disclose something. And then if you do find credible evidence of some sort of wrongdoing, then you do have to disclose it. And then the government will make an assessment of what they want to do. Just because you disclose something doesn't mean that you're going to get in big trouble or that the government's going to suspend you or debar you or terminate your contract or claw back money or any of those things, because it'll depend on what happened. And credible evidence does not mean evidence beyond a reasonable doubt or for sure. So I've been involved in many situations where we've made a disclosure to the government. And my sentence oftentimes in disclosing the government is, out of an abundance of caution, government, we would like you to know that we did an investigation and we learned X about the business. The next sentence usually is, and then it's actually more than a sentence, where I describe X, what our investigation showed. And the next very, very, very important thing that you want to tell the government when you have to make a disclosure is, and here's why it happened, and here's why it's never going to happen again. And depending on what the situation is, the government may or may not debar you or result in other ramifications. We can go to the next slide. So the government also can figure out if you got problems internally, improper conduct. That's what we're talking about today, because as you guys all know on this call, the government has expansive right to audit contracts, invoices, compliance with regulations. If you're a sub, your prime contractors most likely have reserved the same rights for themselves. And if you get subject to an audit and there is findings of wrongdoing, then you'll suffer sanctions for that as well. We can move on to the next slide. Okay, interactions with government officials. So we just sort of covered, like, what are the standards and what are you expected to do as defined in FAR Part 3, sort of at a 1,000-foot level. Comply with the laws, act with integrity, and if you think something is amiss that may not be compliance with criminal laws or you have an invoicing problem of that nature, you may need to investigate and possibly disclose to the government. That's what FAR Part 3 says in a very 1,000 or 2,000 foot level. Let's drill down a little bit more on what it says about interacting with government officials or government employees. Next slide, please. Okay. FAR tells you all that you cannot, well, okay, I merged two things together on this slide so that it's actually practical and useful to you all. The FAR tells you that you're not supposed to be giving gifts of any sort, etc., to government persons. They call it gratuities. You can't give them gratuities, which includes meals, gifts, seminars, all sorts of other things. You're not supposed to be giving that to government officials. But and that's what you as contractors are expected to follow. Meanwhile, your government colleagues, those who work for the government, they are subject to ethics regulations, and those ethics regulations say that they are prohibited from soliciting, that means asking you, or accepting gifts worth more than $20, cash or gift cards, meals. In almost all situations, they're not supposed to accept. They can accept like snacks, bagels, coffee, something like that. One of my clients always gives walnuts and almonds and then some water or something, I believe is what he does. Invites to events are also prohibited in many situations where you're going to be paying for it. But also this includes favors. So if your contracting officer comes to you and says, hey, here's my son's resume, could you guys please hire him? That should be a red flag to you as a FAR violation, but it's also an ethics violation for your government, the government employee who made this ask of you, and it may implicate other situations as well. So anything else that your contract may define as well. Your contract may include restrictions around how you interact with your government persons. So you need to comply with these regulations. The devil is in the details in these things. Things such as cash or gift cards. You can't give a gift card. So you see gifts more than $20 are prohibited. So oftentimes people think to themselves, well, I will give a gift card to Starbucks for $10. I'm in the clear. It doesn't work because the gift card is considered cash. The regulations define a gift card as cash, and so you can't ever give cash to a government person. So no gift cards allowed out there. So in reality, you need to really think before you give anything of value to a government person that you're working with or even that you're not working with. And you want to make sure that you document that well and that you understand it and that you are consistent not only with the FAR, but with their ethics regulations, because you don't want to be the contractor who helps a government employee fall down and trip up over their ethics regulations as well. It's a matter of you helping them help themselves. So that's FAR and ethics regulations on meals, gifts, etc. We can move on to the next slide. Recruiting and hiring from the government. These requirements are in FAR Part 3, but they're in there in a sort of complicated way in that it refers to the Procurement Integrity Act and procurement regulations and personal conflict of interest regulations that limit or even in some cases prohibit how you recruit and hire from the government. So generally, you're prohibited as a government contractor from recruiting government employees while that government employee has duties related to you. So the easiest one to conceptualize is your contracting officer. If your contracting officer tells you that they're getting ready to retire and they would love to come work for you because you seem like a great place to work, you need to stop that conversation immediately, because continuing forward in that conversation not only violates the FAR, but it's a criminal conflict of interest violation. There's criminal penalties. And those criminal penalties and the FAR want you to not even have that sort of conversation with government persons that are involved with you as a contractor. So what do you do in reality? Because just like you all are here taking this training today, government employees get similar training and they're told, do not try to get a job with your contractors that you're overseeing or that you're working with, etc. But there's a ton of regulations out there and there's a ton of laws out there. You all aren't going to remember them and the government employees are not going to remember them. So just think to yourselves, this government employee asks you about working with you and you have anything to do with that government employee, the best thing to do is take a pause. Say, hey, listen, I took some training one time where I don't think we're situated to be able to work with you to even accept your resume because of regulations. I'll go back and check with my lawyer or my ethics person. I think you government person need to go check with your ethics lawyer on this as well. That buys you a little time, and most of the time it'll help the government employee remember that they're not supposed to be doing that. Similarly, not in the FAR, but certainly in conflict of interest regulations and in bribery and corruption statutes, as well as ethics regulations, you're not even supposed to be giving favors to government persons around their resume. So what does favor mean? Sometimes somebody who's worked in the government for a long time, they ask you to look at their resume to see if it could be improved because they don't really know how to build a resume and they'd like some insight from industry. Or they give you the resume saying, hey, we don't want to work for you, but can you forward around to your network? Those are favors that should be avoided because they're going to trip over ethics regulations for the government person, and depending on other factors may create a perception of a conflict of interest between you and the government person that may, again, depending on the facts, appear to be criminal or violative of other statutes. So bottom line on recruiting from government persons, make sure that you know these regulations, that you understand them, and that you avoid recruiting discussions, even accepting of resumes from government persons that your company does business with. And then also have some sort of process in your hiring system to avoid this. Can we go back one slide, please? Thanks. Also, once some government employees are hired, depending on what they did for the government, if they are very high ranking or they had some sort of involvement with your organization, the work that they do, they may be restricted. They may be restricted in that they can only work in the back office for a period of time and cannot go with your company to the agency where they came from, or their compensation may even be restricted. So you'll have to check that out when it comes to recruiting and then actually hiring from the government. Next slide, please. Personal conflicts of interest. This is in the FAR, and it talks about the fact that your people, your employees, should not have a personal conflict of interest when working on a government contract. I'm going to juxtapose this to another section of the FAR where it's organizational conflicts. That's when it's the organization that may have a conflict of interest. We are not talking about this here. We're talking about the personal conflicts of interest. We just talked about a personal conflict of interest between a government person looking to get hired by your company. That is a personal conflict of interest for that government person. They have a conflict. They are supposed to be neutral and objective for the government, but now they're trying to get a job with you. So the theory is they may show favoritism towards your business, and that's a conflict of interest. And the government doesn't even want an appearance of that sort of conflict happening. But it's broader than that. It applies to you guys, employees, as well. So if you are a government contractor and somebody in the government says to you, can you hire my cousin's business to be your subcontractor? Personal conflict of interest. If a government person with whom you don't even have a contracting relationship with asks you to invest in their business or to help partly own their business, that may be considered a personal conflict of interest as well. And then I have down there at the bottom, negotiating employment. We just discussed that could pose a personal conflict of interest. The government expects you all as government contractors to be performing work and making your decisions free of any sort of conflict that you may have with the government person or the government writ large. So the theory is, if you are in business, if you own a business with a government employee at a particular agency and you're a contractor at that particular agency, the theory is neither you nor that government person may be acting objectively. You may be acting in the best interest of your business and not in the best interest of the United States government. And the FAR Part 3 says that you cannot do that. One last thing on this. Oftentimes people ask about, well, does anyone ever get in trouble for this? Personal conflicts of interest, recruiting and hiring? And the answer is yes. A relatively recent one, maybe like 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, Gallup, the organization that does the polling, they were involved in recruiting their contracting officer to come work with Gallup. And that is a conflict of interest. Gallup got in trouble and the contracting officer got in trouble. But one of the biggest prosecutions around this was Boeing. And this was many years ago, where a government employee at DOD was securing herself a job at Boeing, although she had procurement responsibilities relative to Boeing. She ended up getting charged with a crime, and the chief financial officer of Boeing also ended up getting charged with a felony for recruiting her, and that chief financial officer of Boeing ended up getting put on probation for that felony. And the government person, she got in big trouble as well from a criminal perspective, a felony conviction for improperly recruiting and hiring government persons. So it does happen. Those are some of the recent ones that have made news, but there's a whole bunch of smaller situations that occur on a fairly regular basis, and it could bring, problems with you in contract performance. It could expose you to debarment. It could also expose you to criminal liability, depending on the situation. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so the Procurement Integrity Act, I referred to it above around recruiting and hiring. That's because the Procurement Integrity Act is the place where those regulations around how you can recruit and hire from the government sit. So when the government says contractors, you can only recruit and hire from the government in certain situations, it's the Procurement Integrity Act that defines some of those situations. It's also the criminal conflict of interest law. But the Procurement Integrity Act covers more than just recruiting and hiring. It is, as it's named, dedicated to making sure that the procurement process for the United States is fair and objective, and the government's going to get its best value. So as part of that, the Procurement Integrity Act restricts government persons from disclosing procurement information, procurement sensitive information. But it also restricts you all from obtaining non-public procurement sensitive information. Non-public procurement information can be government information. So it could be their if they're holding a solicitation and they've ranked their bidders, that type of information is non-public government procurement information. Anything related to the procurement process or the source selection process that is not public is covered by the Procurement Integrity Act, and the government shouldn't be giving it to you all, and you all shouldn't be getting it. But it also applies to the procurement sensitive information of other contractors. So their bid, proposal, pricing, and other information is also protected by the Procurement Integrity Act, such that you should not be obtaining that either. The FAR Part 3 tells us that if a government official, government person learns that there were disclosures of procurement sensitive information that should not have been made, or contractors have obtained procurement sensitive information that they should not have been receiving, the government contracting officers, they have to go report that activity, and then the government will investigate into it. You can see below in this slide, my last little bullet says government officials are prohibited from accepting compensation from contractors in certain circumstances. We talked about that above. But the main focus of this slide that I want to talk about is getting access to or obtaining procurement sensitive information either from the government or other contractors when that information is not public. So you need to be careful about that. When you attend Jennifer Chauce's presentations around FAR Part 9, Organizational Conflict of Interest, you'll learn that receiving this sort of information can present a conflict of interest and knock a contractor out of a solicitation opportunity. It can also cause termination of contracts. It can cause debarment. And then there also, if you improperly obtain procurement information, it can also carry with it at times criminal liability. This is a challenging one in reality because oftentimes a contractor will get procurement sensitive information from the government just because somebody accidentally typed in somebody's email improperly. So even if you get it that way and you get the procurement sensitive information accidentally because somebody typed in your email when they meant to type somebody else's email in, it doesn't relieve you of your obligation to comply with this. You need to make sure that you properly dispose of that information and that you are clear on what you need to do to protect your company to be able to stay in the procurement and that you've handled that information properly. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the FAR Part 3, which is where we are right now today, says that a government person cannot use federal funds to lobby, excuse me, not a government person, a government contractor cannot use federal funds to lobby. Lobbying actually has a very broad definition, far more broad than most people think about. People think about lobbying, marching up to Congress to influence policy decisions or budgetary decisions. But lobbying actually means communicating with the legislative branch, for sure, Congress, but it's also the executive branch as well. So it includes doing work to influence or attempt to influence folks in the executive branch in connection with the award of a contract. So you're not supposed to use your federal funds to do that. You need to have your federal funds earmarked and not deployed to support any lobbying activity you do. This is not to say that you cannot lobby as a government contractor. It's just to say that you need to be very precise on the source of funds that you're using to pay for your lobbying. Additionally, although not on the FAR, if you are lobbying, you need to make sure that you register as a lobbyist. And remember that registration applies to individuals and organizations. So no federal funds can be used to pay for your lobbying activities. When you submit your RFP or sign for a contract or sign for SAM, you're certifying that nope, we've not used any federal funds to lobby. Next slide. Make sure you have financial controls to follow your funds so that you know that they don't get used for lobbying. Next slide. Lobbying, we briefly talked on this. Here's the definition for your reference. I know Jennifer allows these slides to be shared. So here's the definition for your reference. It includes influencing or attempting to influence the government person to do something. The key part, so that you don't think that every time you're communicating with a government employee that in fact you're lobbying, the key parts of the Lobbying Act is that you need to be having these communications with somebody who is high ranking enough in the government as defined by the lobbying registration regulations to be sure that you're lobbying. And you also need to spend a particular amount of time doing it before you cross over the lobbying threshold. But with that said, again, no federal funds to pay for your lobbying activities, even if you haven't crossed over the threshold to register as a lobbyist. Moving on to the next slide. Okay, so I sort of hit on this as we went through here. This presentation is focused on the FAR, but as I said, there's other regulations that are sort of, you guys get the FAR in your RFPs and you get the FAR in your contracts. But That doesn't mean you're not subject to other laws and regulations. We talked about the Procurement Integrity Act that prohibits conflicts of interest related to how you recruit and hire. It also includes requirements around how and when you get non-public information from the government. We talked about criminal conflicts of interest laws that also talk about how you recruit and hire from the government. And then there's government ethics regulations. Those, CFR means Code of Federal Register, Code of Federal Regulations, I'm sorry. The government ethics regulations do not apply to you all as contractors. And many contractors think, well, if those regulations around meals and gifts and entertainment don't apply to me, why can't I just offer meals, gifts, or entertainment to the government persons? Number one, the FAR says you can't. But number two, you don't want to be that contractor, right? You don't want to be the contractor who is offering or having conversations with the government person that makes them possibly in violation of ethics regulations. So some examples of that are when government persons might ask you to support a charity or an event that they are part of, and you think to yourself, it's not a gift, it's not a meal, it's not some sort of entertainment, it's supporting a charity. The government ethics regulations tell government employees that asking contractors for contributions to a charity on behalf of the government contractor violates their ethics regulations. Again, that doesn't apply to you all as contractors, but I don't think you want to be the contractor who helps the government person violate those ethics regulations. Another thing to remember is that there's state laws and regulations that apply to a lot of this as well, whether or not you're a state government contractor or not. State laws will have conflicts of interest regulations, and they will have other regulations that prohibit certain corrupt activity or certain improper activity with government officials out there. We can move on to the next slide. Okay, so corruption. I put corruption in here. Corruption is offering or promising, exchanging something of value for the purpose of getting business from the government, getting the government trying to influence an act or influence a decision, which includes trying to get a person in the government not to act. It's just securing any improper advantage. And there are federal laws and regulations that prohibit corruption. There are US state laws and regulations that prohibit corruption. And then there's US laws that prohibit US companies from engaging in corruption overseas. I put corruption in here because the FAR doesn't have a clause or a regulation or a section that says you cannot engage in corruption. This goes back to number one, it's a crime, corruption is, so it doesn't need to be in the FAR. So the FAR doesn't need to tell you not to engage in providing something of value for the purpose of getting some sort of government advantage, because there's a criminal statute that says you can't do it. But second, this also goes to that notion that I talked about in the beginning around operating with integrity and making decisions of ethics. So let's use the example of the contracting officer asking you to do the favor of reviewing their resume or asking you to do the favor of hiring their son or daughter to work for you. Those sorts of things, depending on the situation, can be perceived by other contractors, by others in the government, or by prosecutors as a corrupt act. Like, I have had occasions where clients have called up and said, hey, the government contracting officer wants me to hire their son. That is a legitimate scenario. And the answer to that needs to be no, not so much for a FAR-based reason, but because it would certainly look like corruption. You hire the contracting officer kid to work in your business, and then you continue to get awards, you get favorable performance reviews from that contractor, or anything else. It would not look very neutral or objective, and it would look like it is running afoul of certain regulations. And many times, especially in government contracting, that perception of wrongdoing can be as fatal or as problematic to a contractor as actually doing something wrong, because other contractors or government persons can turn you in, and then all of a sudden you're facing an investigation, which can be costly. So keep that in mind as you work with your government persons. Let's move on to the next slide. Interacting with other businesses. FAR Part 3 includes guidance for you and regulations on how you can interact with other businesses. Let's talk about some of those. Next slide, please. So, one way that you are guided by the FAR on how you can interact with other businesses is collusive bidding. It's also sort of like independent pricing. Again, going back to certifications and representations, when you turn in an RFP or sign a contract or your SAM, you're certifying that the price that you have offered to the government, you arrived at independently. And what that means is your business decided on its own what you should charge for the goods or the services or the software that you're selling to the government. Your price had to have been decided independently, and you're promising the government that you do that. So thinking about independent pricing requirements that are in FAR Part 3 is a little bit difficult until you think about what does the government want you not to do. They want you to give them an independent price that's based on your company's unique cost and pricing experience. What do they want you not to do? They do not want you to engage in collusive bidding. That's anti-competitive behavior, violations of antitrust law. So what can collusive bidding look like? Rotating low bidders. If you work with a bunch of primes and subs, if you all discuss amongst yourselves that one of you is going to be the low bidder and the rest of you are not going to bid, or you are going to bid but you're not going to be the low bidder, that is collusive bidding. That is not independent pricing. Deciding to divide up markets, for example, either geographically or by agency. Again, if you have other businesses you work with regularly and you decide that you're going to handle all procurements out of HHS and they're going to handle all procurements out of DoD health organizations, and you're going to flip back and forth between prime and sub, or you're going to flip back and forth between who's going to bid when, that too is collusive bidding, and it's not independent pricing. Deciding not to bid or withdrawing a bid, it can also be collusive bidding if that's done with the mind that you're trying to manage the bidding process for the government. Those sorts of situations, and then the obvious one, agreeing on a low price, agreeing on a scope of work, and you won't offer anything else unless you cost more money, charge the government more money. All of those sorts of things are prohibited by the FAR. They're prohibited by antitrust regulations or laws. And last, you're certifying to the government that you didn't do any of those things, that you arrived at your price independently. That's part of FAR Part 3. One other thing that the government has in FAR Part 3 is kickbacks. A kickback is an arrangement between contractors so that one contractor, say a prime, provides something of value to another contractor in exchange for some sort of favorable treatment between the two, prime and sub. This could be anything. A kickback could be subcontractors saying to a prime, we'll give you better pricing if you continue to use us. It could be the prime saying to the subcontractor, we'll give you low rate interest loans if you join our team. Those sorts of things are considered a kickback, and you're not choosing one another because of the value you offer as a team to the government. You're doing it because you're kicking back some sort of favor or benefit to the other party to entice them to do business with you. FAR Part 4 says, nope, you cannot do that. Moving on. Procurement integrity. We talked about this a little bit earlier when it related to how you interact with the government, and it involves making sure that you do not get non-public information about a procurement or a source selection process from government persons. But it also applies when you're working with other business partners. It prohibits disclosing or receiving procurement sensitive information before it's publicly available or before a contract award. And you can't get it from your business partners either intentionally or accidentally. So if you're working with a business partner and they tell you, hey, I was on another proposal team, and in that experience, I got the pricing and the cost of another government contractor who's bidding, here it is. That is not allowed by FAR Part 3. It's not allowed by the Procurement Integrity Act. You also, as contractors, should be marking your own procurement sensitive information as such, putting a marker on your procurement sensitive information, alerting the government and other contractors this is our procurement sensitive confidential information that we do not share publicly. Things like our costs, our pricing information, or any other tools, methodologies, or data that's the intellectual property of your company that you protect and secure. You should mark it so that you protect it, such that if it is exploited or accidentally shared with other contractors, you're able to clearly point to the government that your procurement sensitive information has been improperly shared and you would like some sort of remedy from the government for that problem. The Procurement Integrity Act and the FAR also prohibit something called buying in. This is submitting a low price with the plan that, okay, if I get the work at this super low price over the life of the contract, I'm going to try to do things to add more work to my contract, or I'm going to try to get future work or follow-on work. And at that point, I'm going to charge the government a much higher price to make up my lowball offer that I did initially. The government is alert to this. They're trained to look out for this. They're trained to look out for government contractors, enticing them to contract with you because you've offered a super low bid, and then later you increase the work or the price to try to get that back. That's not allowed, and the government is told to look out for it. Next slide, please. Okay, so operationalizing these requirements. It's great for us to sit here and for me to go over all these regulations and say you can't do this or you got to do that. But here's the thing, how do you do it like as a business? Like how do you get up in the morning and say, gosh, I got to follow FAR Part 3. How do I do it? Here's a couple ideas on how to do that. Let's talk about operationalizing these requirements in our last 7 minutes. You can move to the next slide. Okay, first, FAR Part 3 says you're supposed to have an ethics and compliance program. This helps you operationalize those requirements because by having an ethics and compliance program, you're training your employees, you're communicating with employees on these requirements. You also should have policies and procedures that you alert your employees, hey, here's what is procurement sensitive information, and we can't get it improperly and we have to protect ours. Employees, here's a policy on how we recruit and hire from the government. And then you have the FAR Part requirements in there. So creating policies and procedures that are clear and understandable for your employees to follow. Here's a hint. Don't write a policy or a procedure that says our policy is to follow the law. Your employees have no idea what that means. If I saw a policy like that, I wouldn't know what that means. So write policies and procedures that tell your employees how they can recruit and hire from the government. Have a policy or procedure that says we don't recruit and hire from the government when the government persons are involved with our business. And then give them something actually that they could do in the policy or procedure so that they know how to do it the right way. Like I said, once you have your policies and procedures, you should also train your policies and procedures. You're required to give notice to your employees so that if they do have the concern, they can raise it to the government, like through a whistleblower hotline, fraud and abuse hotline. If you do have policies and procedures and you have employees who violate those policies and procedures, you need to make sure you discipline them. Even if they're a high-ranking or very valuable employee and they flaunt your policies and don't follow them, you need to mete out a discipline. Another important part of having an ethics and compliance program is having a code of conduct that makes it clear to your employees that your company is going to follow the FAR in that you're going to comply with the laws, but you're also going to make decisions of integrity and ethics. Make sure somebody in your organization is responsible for your ethics and compliance program, and then do something so that you can assess your risk of not complying with these laws and regulations. Do you have a really robust recruiting and hiring function who's very aggressive on reaching out to all sorts of people on LinkedIn? Well, then there's a risk there that they're going to reach out to somebody who's a government person who they can't reach out to, and you want to assess the risk of that situation turning into a violation. Same thing with gifts, same thing with personal conflicts of interest, or all the things that we've discussed today. Internal controls to prevent or detect illegal activity, those are your policies and procedures. And then you want to regularly train, like I said, communicate to your employees. You want to have your employees be encouraged to raise concerns, to ask questions, also known as a whistleblower. Encourage them to raise concerns, encourage your employees to ask questions, because lots of times the employees will come to the employer and say, hey, I don't know if we're doing this right. Can we fix it? It's worth looking into and seeing if they're onto something, because if they are, you could fix it, and it saves a lot of grievance before you continue to engage in behavior that doesn't follow the law. We can move to the next slide. Protecting whistleblowers. When somebody does raise a concern at your organization, you cannot retaliate against them. That means you can't fire them or demote them or discriminate them or do anything unfair to them just because they filed the complaint. This includes everything. This means you can't move their offices in a way to sort of be retaliating against them or taking negative action against them because they raised a complaint. It also means banning them from meetings. Like, you get irritated because somebody's complaining about something, and so you decide, I'm just going to quit inviting them to these meetings. That's retaliation, and it's not treating your whistleblowers fairly. The FAR says you have to treat them fairly. You cannot do things against them to demote or discriminate or otherwise give them a hard time in the workplace, because it's a violation of the FAR. If this happens, the IG will investigate, and you may face ramifications. You should also have whistleblower posters in your offices or on the intranet, because you're required to do so. And then you got to be careful about having your employees sign confidentiality agreements that say that they're not going to report anything outside of your company, because the FAR doesn't allow for that, nor do other regulations. Next slide, please. Some practical tips. We talked about training. Train your employees, and then once you train them on your policy and procedures, have them certify that they don't have any questions and that they understand how to follow those. In your subcontracts, include clauses that say your subs are going to follow the ethics and compliance clauses and requirements of the FAR. Primes, remember, you need to make sure that your subs are behaving themselves, so you should be looking out for them tripping over these requirements as well. For your meals and gifts, have an approval process of some sort, and make sure that your finance team is educated to look out for meals or something that may be improper with government information. We talked about marking your information. Recruiting and hiring, make sure you have some sort of methodology to define or identify government persons who may be interested in working with you, because they may be conflicted out from the interviewing process. Encourage your employees to talk to you and raise concerns, and make sure your employees understand personal conflicts of interest. Starting a business with your contracting officer representative or something like that, those are very basic ones, but make sure you have a personal conflicts of interest policy that your employees understand and can follow. And one final thought for you all, and I get this all the time, and it's a tough situation to be in. Just because your CO or COTAR or somebody else in the government tells you that it's okay and tells you to do it or asks you to do it, it does not mean that you can do it. And if you do it and they were wrong, you're just as liable as if you decided to do it on your own. So always reality check and gut check. If somebody in the government asks you and your business or your employees to do something, make sure that you independently know that it's an okay thing to do, because just saying the government told me I could do it is not going to inoculate you or protect you from an accusation of wrongdoing. Okay, next slide. And that is it. We made it. It's 1 o'clock. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. I most appreciate your time and your attention, and enjoy the rest of the presentations that Chouse and Associates will be putting on. Sophia, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Margaret, for a very informative presentation. And thanks to everyone who joined us today also. As mentioned, you can always catch the recording of this on our YouTube channel within 24 hours and find over 600 additional webinars on government contracting there. And also just a quick friendly reminder that tickets are going fast for our winter soiree. Please join us in many federal agencies and departments on Monday, February 12th. Sign up by going to our website and selecting the Events tab. Scroll down to the event, and we hope to see you there. And that's it for today's webinar. Thank you again to our speaker, Margaret Cassidy, and everybody who joined us. Have a wonderful Friday.